What's up, everyone, and welcome back to our Black History Nugget. This is episode 5. In episode 4, we were talking about the children of Israel. We asked the question, were the children of Israel in Egypt, in Egyptian bondage for 400 years? And we began answering that question. We are going to pick back up today to follow up and finish answering that question. Were the children of Israel really in Egyptian bondage for 400 years? And so we ended off, we were looking at Genesis chapter 15 and verse 13, which is a text that is often used to justify this belief that uh, the children of Israel were in Egyptian bondage for 400 years. And the text says, "Then he said to Abram, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them and afflict them 400 years." Now, we looked at Genesis 15:13, and then we also looked at Exodus chapter 12 and verse 40. Exodus chapter 12 and verse 40. And we saw that these two scriptures uh, are in contradiction to one another. In Exodus 12, verse 40 says, "Now the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years." And so in Genesis 15, verse 13, we see 400 years. And then in Exodus 12:40, we see 430 years. And so we began to try to reconcile which one is it. And we learned that in the Samaritan Pentateuch and in the Greek Septuagint, it actually reads Egypt and Canaan, instead of just Egypt, which makes a lot of sense. And we'll unpack that a little bit more in a moment. And so, but if we continue on in Genesis chapter 46 and verse 26, it says, "All the persons who went with Jacob to Egypt, who came from his body, besides Jacob's sons' wives, were 66 persons in all." So, besides Jacob's sons' wives, there were 66 people who Egypt, went into Egypt with Jacob. And then it says in Genesis 46, verses 8 and 9, "Now these were the names of the children of Israel, Jacob and his sons, who went to Egypt. Reuben was Jacob's firstborn. The sons of Reuben were Hanok, Palu, Hezron, and Carmi. The sons of Simeon were Jemuel, Jamin, Ohad, Jachin, Zohar, and Shaul, the son of a Canaanite woman. The sons of Levi were Gershon, Kohath, and Merari." So going into Egypt was Levi. Sons of Levi were Gershon, Kohath. Kohath was one of the sons that went in. Uh, in Exodus 6 and verse 18, it says, "And the sons of Kohath were Amram, Izhar, Hebron, and Uzziel. And the years of the life of Kohath were 133." So you have Kohath who goes in, and it says the years of his life were 133. So he lived 133 years. He has sons. One of the sons was Amram. So Kohath would live 133 years. Exodus chapter 6 and verse 20 says, "And the years of the life of Amram, which was Kohath's son, were 137." So Amram was born in Egypt. He lives 137 years. Okay? He lives 137 years. He's born in Egypt. Then it says Moses, who is Amram's son, was 80 years old, and Aaron 83 years old when they spoke to Pharaoh. So when they speak to Pharaoh, they're of course speaking to Pharaoh in order to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt. Out of Egypt. So Moses left Egypt when he was 80 years old. Now remember, Moses was born in Egypt. So you have Kohath, who lived 133 years. You have Amram, who lived 137 years. And then you have Moses, who led them out at 80 years. Now, this is the thing. 133 plus 137 plus 80 equals 350 years. 350 years. So Kohath comes in. Kohath comes in. He lives 133 years. He lives 133 years. He has his son, Amram, who lives 137 years. Amram has a son who would lead the children of Israel out of Egypt at 80 years old. Now, we understand that when Kohath went in, he was not a baby, but we can just assume, let's assume, just for the sake of argument, that Kohath was a baby when he went into Egypt. We know that he was not 133 years old also when he had Amram, which means that their times, the 133 and the 137, would have overlapped. But if you choose to just say they went in as he went in as a baby, 133, he lived 133 years. At 133 years, he would have a son. His son would live 137 years. And then his son would have Moses, who would lead the children of Israel out at 80. That would be 350 years at the very most that the children of Israel could have been in Egypt. 350 years, which means that the children of Israel were not in Egypt 400 years. They were not in Egypt 430 years. They were not in Egyptian bondage. They were not in Egyptian bondage for 400 years. So let's continue on. They were in Egypt and Canaan. Remember, we saw in Exodus chapter 12 and verse 40 that according to the Greek Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch, it says, according to Exodus 12 and verse 40, that they were in Egypt and Canaan for 430 years. But how do we know? How do we know that they were in Egypt and Canaan for 430 years? How do we reconcile that? Well, in Galatians chapter 3, verse 16, it says, now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He does not say into seeds as of many, but as of one, and to your seed, who is Christ. And this I say, that the law, which was 430 years later. So from the time that Abraham receives the promise until the time that Moses receives the law was 430 years. 430 years. From the time that Abraham received the promise to the time that Moses received the law was 430 years. Genesis 12, verse 2 through 4. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, make your name great. You shall be a blessing. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. So Abram receives the promise at 75 years old. He receives the promise when he is 75 years old. So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. So 75 years old when he received the promise. Okay? 75 years old. Now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. So he receives the promise at 75. 25 years later, he has his son Isaac. All right? When he is 100 years old, when Abraham is 100 years old, he has Isaac. Genesis 35, verse 26 says, afterward his brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. So Isaac is 60 years old. Abraham's son Isaac is 60 years old, okay, when he has his son, all right? So you have the 25, from 25, Abraham is 75 years old, right? When he has the promise, 25 years later, at 100, he has his son Isaac. 60 years later, Isaac has his son, right? Abraham, Isaac, then Jacob. So he has his son Jacob at 60 years old. So 25 plus 60 is 85, right? 25 plus 60 is 85. The 25 from Abraham, all right? Because after he had the promise, so from the time of the promise at 75 years old, he receives the promise at 75 years old. When he's 100 is when he has his son Isaac. 60 years later, Isaac has Jacob. Genesis 47 verse 9, and Jacob said to Pharaoh, the days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years old. 130 years. So Jacob dies at 130. So you have what? Promise received at 75. Isaac is born at 100. Isaac has Jacob when he is 60 years old. When Isaac is 60 years old, Jacob arrives in Egypt. Jacob arrives in Egypt at 130. All right. 130. All right. So you have 25 plus 60 plus the 130 equals 215. 215, which means 215 years in Egypt and 215 years in Canaan. So remember, 215 years in Canaan, because remember, Abraham is in Canaan when he has the promise, when he receives the promise. All right. So that total is 215 years. Now remember, we said it's 430 years. So we were trying to figure out, where does the 430 years in Exodus chapter 12 in verse 40 come from? Okay? Because remember, it says in Egypt and Canaan for 430 years, not just Egypt. Now in your Bible, it says just Egypt. But when you look at the note at the bottom of your Bible, it says Egypt and Canaan. So we were asking the question, okay, how do we reconcile the 430 years with the 400 years we read in Genesis 15:13? And we saw that in Galatians 3 and verse 16 to 17, Paul says that from the time of the promise until the giving of the law was 430 years. From the time that Abraham received the promise to the time that Moses received the law was 430 years. So that 430 years was 215 years that the children of Israel were in Canaan, and then 250 years that they were in Egypt. Which means that they were not in Egypt for 400 years. They were not in Egyptian bondage for 400 years. Interesting. Which means that, before we even get there, what we have to do now is we have to find out, okay, if they were in Egypt for 215 years, were they in bondage for 215 years? That's a good question. And that question we will answer in our Black History Nugget episode 6 tomorrow. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next stream.